Welcome to the Church Ready podcast. The church's mission doesn't change because of AI, but the infrastructure that sustains that mission has to. Let's join your hosts, Bradley Willis and Elizabeth Carter, for honest conversations about AI and the church.
You know, you hear it constantly from church leaders right now. It's almost like this collective sigh of relief.
Oh, yeah.
Like you'll be in a room with pastors, the topic of technology comes up, and someone will inevitably just say, well, AI is a tech problem. It's not really a church problem.
Right. And honestly, you can completely understand why they feel that that profound sense of comfort.
Yeah.
Because when a pastor looks out from the stage on Sunday morning, the room looks exactly the same as it did like 3 years ago.
Totally.
The worship band is playing, families are walking through the physical doors, the offering is still being collected. I mean, the sensory experience of church just hasn't changed.
Right. But in today's episode, we are looking at research and data that proves why that specific comfort is actually but a massive financial vulnerability.
Huge.
Mistaking what hasn't changed yet for what isn't changing at all is arguably the biggest blind spot in church leadership today. I'm Bradley Willis.
And I'm Elizabeth Carter.
We are the host of the Church Ready podcast, where we have strategic conversations about AI and the church. And our mission today is to take all this vague, abstract anxiety about artificial intelligence and really ground it. We want to help you discover the highly concentrated financial exposures that are honestly likely hiding in plain sight within your congregation right now.
Yeah, the goal here is absolute clarity, because we see churches making incredibly costly financial mistakes regarding AI, mostly because they're operating in the dark.
Yeah.
Taking action without clarity, without actually understanding the mechanisms of how your specific church is exposed, it's just going to drain your resources, and it leaves your actual vulnerabilities completely untouched.
Exactly. So let's start by looking at a massive vulnerability that doesn't even begin with AI. It's a pre-existing condition in most church financial systems. We're calling it budgeting on assumption.
Right.
Because I'm looking at the broader financial data for churches across the country, and it actually seems backward. Giving has felt, relatively steady for a lot of congregations over the last 3 years.
It has.
So if the spreadsheet looks healthy, why is this a crisis?
Well, the crisis is hidden inside that very steadiness. Because giving has felt so reliable for so long, leadership teams have just, they've stopped asking the hard structural questions about where that money is actually coming from.
Oh, yeah.
Because steady giving is absolutely not the same thing as understood giving. A church can hit its monthly financial target, the finance committee can high five, and yet the leadership might have literally zero understanding of how highly concentrated that giving is.
Meaning it's coming from just a handful of households.
Exactly.
So it's basically an illusion of safety. You're looking at the top line revenue, but totally ignoring the load-bearing pillars underneath it.
Right.
If a church doesn't know what happens to their operating budget, if just say 5 of their top giving families lose their income simultaneously, then they don't actually understand their budget. They're just, they're assuming it will always be there.
Yeah, and that assumption ignores a fundamental economic reality of pastoral care, which is that church giving is a lagging indicator.
Okay, unpack that.
Well, it is rarely the first thing a family cuts when they hit financial hardship.
Which is fascinating, right? Because purely from a secular financial advising standpoint, charitable giving is usually categorized as discretionary.
Right.
You'd think it'll be the very first thing to go when a family's budget gets tight. Why are people holding on to their tithe while, cutting everything else?
Because for a dedicated family in your congregation, giving isn't just a line item. It is a deeply ingrained spiritual discipline.
Yeah.
It's tied to their identity, their community, their faith commitment. So when a family experiences a sudden loss of income, say a primary earner gets laid off, they view cutting their tithe as a spiritual failure. They will quietly draw down their personal savings. They will put their groceries on a credit card. They will silently absorb immense financial pressure for months just to keep their offering consistent.
That is incredibly profound. But from a leadership perspective, it is terrifying.
It really is.
It's like driving a car down the highway by only looking in the rearview mirror. Relying on this week's offering plate to gauge your congregation's current financial health is essentially looking at the past.
Yes.
By the time the offering actually drops in your monthly reports, the leak in the gas tank has been happening for 6 or 8 months.
That rearview mirror analogy captures the danger perfectly. The exposure didn't start the moment the finance committee noticed a dip in revenue. The erosion happened underneath you, quietly, for half a year. That is the flame of assumption-based budgeting. Reading a steady number today as absolute proof that tomorrow is safe is a failure to understand the underlying mechanics of your congregation's economic reality. And that flame, it's burning in churches right now before AI even enters the conversation.
But that raises a huge question. If we know the baseline financial structure of the church is already fragile and built on lagging indicators, well, what happens when we introduce a massive disruptor into that system?
Right.
Because AI is arriving, but it's not showing up as a robot vacuuming the sanctuary. It is arriving directly in your congregation's paychecks.
Yes. This is where the macroeconomic trends actually hit the local church budget. We have to look at the mechanisms of artificial intelligence and who is actually exposed right now.
Okay.
Large language models and generative AI, they aren't displacing physical labor. They excel at pattern recognition, data synthesis, text generation. That means the roles being automated this quarter, not a decade from now, but right now, are white-collar knowledge work roles.
So we're talking about accounting, administration, claims adjusters, customer service, and, middle management.
Exactly.
And when you look at the demographic makeup of a typical church, those specific professions are the exact backbone of church giving. I mean, for decades, those roles have provided the reliable, predictable W-2 salary income that sustains predictable weekly tithing.
Yeah, and the disruption isn't just that these jobs are evaporating entirely, though, some definitely are. The deeper disruption is that the fundamental nature of how these people earn their income is being forced to change.
Yeah.
When a 45-year-old middle manager gets displaced by automation, they don't typically just walk into another identical corporate role. They're increasingly forced to pivot into the gig economy or fractional consulting.
Yeah, and here at Church Ready, we have been tracking this data closely, and the shift is just staggering. Contract and gig-based work has grown from about a quarter of the workforce to over a third of the workforce in just a few short years. That is a massive tectonic shift in how families earn a living. And the mechanism here is crucial. Gig work and freelance consulting carry immense month-to-month volatility.
And volatility is the absolute enemy of predictable tithing.
Right.
Just imagine that displaced manager who used to give exactly $800 on the first of every month because they had a steady salary.
Yeah, set it and forget it.
Exactly. But now, as a fractional consultant, they might invoice $10,000 one month and completely zero out the next 2 months while they hunt for new clients. Even if their annual income ends up being similar, their cash flow is entirely erratic. It becomes practically impossible for them to sustain a predictable, automated monthly tithe.
So we had this pre-existing flame churches budgeting on assumption and relying on lagging indicators. And now we have AI disruption accelerating the transition to gig work, and it's acting like gasoline being poured directly onto that flame. Yeah. The households that you rely on to fund your ministry are experiencing intense economic volatility. You won't even see the smoke until the fire's already out of control.
Right. The vulnerability was always there. The concentration of giving was always a risk. Job displacement and financial hardship driven by AI is simply the accelerant now arriving on top of it, exposing the fragility faster than most leadership teams can ever react.
The church's mission doesn't change because of AI, but the infrastructure that sustains that mission may need to. If you have never considered how AI disruptions will impact your congregation and church budget, the Church Readiness Assessment is the right next step. It only takes 10 minutes. There's a link in the show notes.
And taking that baseline measurement is so critical because it forces a leadership team to confront the gap between what they read in the news and what is actually happening in their pews. Which brings us to the second major mistake churches are making right now.
I want to push on that gap between the news and the pew. Let's say a pastor is listening to this episode. They read the articles, they see the Church Ready data, they understand the AI trends perfectly.
Sure.
Why is it that in so many cases, their church's budget for next year ends up looking exactly like last year's budget? They have the knowledge. Why does nothing actually change?
Because they are falling into the trap of abstract information.
Okay.
There is a vast difference between gathering general knowledge and allowing that knowledge to force a specific decision.
Right.
Knowing the general macroeconomic trend of AI job displacement is intellectually interesting, but it is fundamentally different from knowing which specific households in your actual congregation are exposed to that displacement.
So it's trend knowledge versus exposure knowledge.
Yes, let's break down the difference. Trend knowledge is reading a headline that AI is automating accounting and administrative roles across the country. That is a fact.
Yeah.
But to a pastor, it remains abstract. It's a story about the national economy happening out there somewhere. It doesn't have a face.
And exposure knowledge.
Exposure knowledge has a face. It is putting real names to the data. It's knowing exactly how many accountants, claims adjusters, and administrative staff are physically sitting in your building on a Sunday morning.
Wow.
It's the sobering realization that 40% of your operating budget is funded by families working in the 3 industries most vulnerable to automation this year. That isn't a story about the economy anymore. That is a story about Tuesday's staff meeting and whether you can afford to keep the youth pastor on payroll.
Okay, but practically speaking, let's talk about how a pastor actually gets that exposure knowledge. Because I can hear a church leader right now saying, I want to know this, but how do I ethically find out where my congregation works without, aggressively interrogating them? I mean, I can't just corner people in the lobby and demand their W-2s.
Right. It's a very valid concern, and it requires a shift in how we view pastoral care. Discovering this isn't about being invasive, it's about holistic shepherding. Most churches already use church management software, or CHMS, which has fields for occupation and industry, but usually those fields are 90% blank.
Right. Nobody fills them out.
Exactly. So a church can run a simple, vision-driven, update your profile campaign, explaining that the church wants to better support and pray for the congregation in their specific vocations.
I love that. That reframes it beautifully. It's not about tracking their wallets. It's about understanding their daily lives.
Yes.
You can also gather anonymous demographic data during a pledge drive or capital campaign, or, honestly, just through intentional pastoral conversations. Training your small group leaders to understand the professional landscape of their groups adds massive value to your pastoral care pipeline, while simultaneously giving leadership a heat map of economic vulnerability.
Exactly. It takes the knowledge out of the abstract and makes it actionable, because knowledge that doesn't reach a targeted decision isn't stewardship, it's just anxious awareness.
But wait, let me play devil's advocate here for a second. Let's say a pastor realizes this is a threat, but they don't want to do the hard work of gathering that specific exposure knowledge. Isn't a general awareness of the trend enough to just start acting defensively?
What do you mean?
Why not just trim the budget universally? Let's just mandate a 10% cut across all ministries just to be safe. Doesn't that insulate the church without needing to pry into people's specific careers?
Well, it's a very common reflex to panic and make universal cuts, but it completely fails to solve the actual problem. Generic reactions don't fix specific exposures.
Okay.
If you trim your budget universally by 10%, you are crippling healthy, thriving ministries without actually addressing the localized risk. Consider this. What if your specific church's exposure isn't a neat, even 10% spread across the congregation?
Right.
What if 40% of your giving is concentrated in a handful of households that all work in middle management at a local tech hub that just announced AI-driven layoffs?
Oh, wow. Yeah, a 10% universal trim does absolutely nothing to save you if that specific 40% block evaporates overnight.
It's like boarding up the front door of your house because you heard there might be a storm, while completely ignoring the fact that the roof over your living room has a massive hole in it.
Yeah.
Pastors need exposure knowledge, not just trend knowledge, to actually build the right defenses.
Which perfectly sets up the final, and frankly, the most costly mistake we see leaders making. This mistake happens when the pressure finally gets too high. A leader feels the weight of assumption-based budgeting, they feel the anxiety of these AI trends, and they decide they have to do something immediately.
Yes, the danger of doing something just for the sake of motion. When anxiety drives leadership, the instinct is to buy a quick fix.
Right.
They'll fly to a big conference, or they'll purchase a generalized, expensive consulting framework or a massive curriculum that promises to universally AI-proof their church structure.
Wait, why is that a mistake, though? From the outside, that looks exactly like proactive leadership. They are taking initiative and trying to protect the mission.
Let's compare the real costs of the 3 mistakes we've discussed, and you'll see why this one is so devastating.
Okay.
The first mistake, Misreading steady giving and budgeting on assumption, that mistake costs you time. You wasted months assuming you were safe while the hidden exposure was building. The second mistake, having trend knowledge but never gathering exposure knowledge, that costs you readiness. You knew the storm was coming, but you didn't board up the windows. Both are failures, but they are essentially costs of delay.
Right. You haven't actually burned resources on the wrong solution yet.
Exactly. But the third mistake, rushing to buy a generalized solution to soothe your anxiety, costs you time. It heavily depletes your budget. And the worst part, it leaves your specific localized problem totally untouched.
Right, because a generalized solution is built for a hypothetical average church.
Yes.
And when it comes to localized giving concentration and specific industry exposure, there is absolutely no such thing as an average church. The economic makeup of a church in suburban Seattle is fundamentally different from a church in rural Texas or downtown Chicago.
So you spend thousands of dollars and months of staff energy implementing a generic program only to discover that it didn't actually measure, prepare for, or protect the specific claims adjusters and administrative assistants sitting in your pews.
Oh.
You walk away with a binder full of generalized strategies applied to the completely wrong target. You aren't back where you started. You are actively behind where you started, with fewer resources to fix the real problem.
You know, Carey Nieuwhof talks about this dynamic in a really compelling way in his upcoming book, AI and the Future Church. He argues that churches have got to build financial and structural shock absorbers long before the pressure arrives.
Yeah, that makes sense.
His point is that if a church is running without margin, if they have no shock absorbers in place, they're going to feel the absolute full force of a financial shock instantly. The impact bypasses any buffer and goes straight into cutting staff and bleeding the mission.
And Carey's diagnosis of the need for margin is spot on. A church running with zero margin is playing a very dangerous game of roulette. But if we applied our framework to that theory, I'd actually argue that we have to push that thinking one step further.
Okay, take it further. Where does the theory of a shock absorber break down in reality?
The reality is that a shock absorber that has never been tested against a specific weight actually tells you nothing about your safety.
Oh, that is a phenomenal point.
You can have financial reserves on a spreadsheet. A finance team can say, look, we have 3 months of operating expenses in a savings account. There's our shock absorber. But if you don't know the specific shape, weight, and concentration of your church's actual exposure, you have absolutely no idea if that shock absorber is strong enough. A book can tell you that shock absorbers are essential, and they absolutely are. But a book cannot measure your specific church's giving concentration.
It can't tell you if the economic shock hitting your congregation is going to be a small bump in the road or 40% cratering of your operating budget because of a localized industry disruption.
Exactly.
If you built a shock absorber meant for a bicycle and a freight train hits it, having the shock absorber didn't actually save you.
The strength of a shock absorber isn't proven just by the fact that it exists on a balance sheet. It is proven by whether it was engineered to hold the actual weight it ends up bearing. And you cannot know that weight without specific, targeted exposure knowledge. Clarity absolutely must come before action.
It reminds me of the wisdom in Proverbs 19. The writer warns that zeal without knowledge is not good, and whoever hurries his footsteps misses the mark. I love that because it's not telling leaders to be passive. It's not saying don't act. It is a stark warning against acting before you have actually seen the reality of your situation clearly. Zeal, energy, and the desire to protect the church aren't the problem. The rushing is the problem. Hurrying past clarity to just buy a generic solution totally misses the mark.
Because motion is so easily confused with direction.
Yes.
A leadership team can be moving 1,000,000 miles an hour, launching new initiatives, and still be no closer to actual structural readiness.
So, how do we flip the script on this? As we wrap up, I want to cast a vision for what this looks like when a church actually gets it right. We call this visionary stewardship, because I know a lot of the data we've discussed today sounds heavy, perhaps even intimidating.
Sure.
But it is actually an incredible historic opportunity for church leaders. Pastors who choose to engage this challenge right now, today, while they still have the mental capacity and the financial runway to do so, are practicing deeply faithful preparation.
It really is the ultimate act of stewardship. It's moving from reactive panic to proactive pastoral care.
And here is the most encouraging part of this entire conversation. You do not have to choose between fixing the flame that is already burning and preparing for the accelerant that is coming, because the exact same infrastructure addresses both.
Yeah.
The hard, necessary work of naming your church's real giving exposure today, moving away from assumption-based budgeting, is the exact same work that builds the readiness your church will rely on as AI continues to reshape the economy.
By understanding the economic realities of your congregation today, you are building the pastoral and financial resilience needed for tomorrow. You are preparing to care for their shifting lives, their faith, and the mission of the church, regardless of what technology does next.
It's all connected.
Yeah.
So to close this out, I want you to think about the practical application of everything we've discussed. Think about your top 5 giving households right now. Do you actually know what specific industries they work in?
That's the question.
And beyond just knowing the job title, do you know how generative AI might be rewriting the rules of those specific industries this very week?
If you don't know the answer to those questions, you don't need to panic. But it does mean you now know exactly where your work begins.
At Church Ready, we help churches solve today's ministry challenges to secure tomorrow's readiness for what AI is changing. Until next time, lead well, steward widely, and trust deeply.
The church's mission doesn't change because of AI, but the infrastructure that sustains that mission has to. If you have never considered how AI disruptions will impact your congregation and church budget, the Church Readiness Assessment is the right next step. It only takes 10 minutes. There is a link in the show notes.